In a small, rural town in the deep South, there was a sheriff whose reputation was built on his strength and unwavering authority. Sheriff Marcus Turner was a man of few words, yet his presence demanded respect. His deep voice echoed across the town's streets as he made his rounds, ensuring that order was maintained in a place where law and justice often clashed. But behind his badge, Sheriff Turner's life was anything but ordinary. His wife, Sarah Turner, a woman with fair skin and a sharp tongue, had been by his side for years. Together, they had a life built on power and status, but beneath the surface, there was a growing tension. Sarah loved her husband deeply, but was increasingly resentful of the secrets he kept from her. And it was one secret that would shatter their lives forever. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the sleepy town, Sheriff Turner's routine took an unexpected turn. He was driving down the back roads of the county, the engine of his patrol car humming softly, when he spotted her. A young girl, no older than 18, sat by the side of the road. Her head hung low as she clutched a dirty, torn blanket around her shoulders. Her appearance was striking. Long, unkempt blonde hair framed her pale face, and her eyes, though weary, held a certain defiance. She was a stark contrast to the otherwise quiet, subdued nature of the town. A homeless girl, abandoned by the world, her life now a series of struggles and survival. Sheriff Turner slowed his patrol car, his gaze fixed on her. Something about her presence called to him, a deep curiosity mixed with the compassion he rarely showed. He stopped the car and rolled down the window. "Hey there, you all right?" His voice was gruff, but there was an edge of concern in his words. The girl lifted her head, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked. She didn't say anything, just shook her head, clearly tired and hungry. Turner took in the sight of her clothes ragged, her body thin, yet there was a certain vulnerability in her that stirred something in him. "Come on," he said, his voice softening. "I can take you to the shelter. It's not much, but at least it'll be warm." She hesitated for a moment, eyeing him with suspicion. He knew how the world worked for girls like her, how trust was a fragile thing. But there was something in her that spoke to him. She nodded slowly, stepping toward the car. Over the next few weeks, the girl, whose name turned out to be Lily, found herself at the mercy of Sheriff Turner's strange kindness. He would stop by the shelter where she was staying, offering food, clothes, and sometimes just a moment of his time. At first, their conversations were casual, just small talk. But as the days turned into weeks, a deeper connection began to form between them, one that neither of them had anticipated. Lily shared stories of her life, how she ended up on the streets, fleeing from an abusive home, searching for a way out, but always finding herself falling deeper into despair. Turner listened with a quiet intensity, his usual stoic demeanor slipping away as he became more invested in her story. There was something about her, something raw and fragile, that touched him in a way he hadn't felt in years. He could feel the weight of her past in the way she spoke, in the sadness that lingered in her eyes, and the way she smiled when she thought no one was watching. In turn, Lily came to rely on Sheriff Turner in ways she hadn't expected. His presence was a balm, soothing the wounds that life had inflicted on her. She felt safe around him, something she hadn't felt in a long time. But as the weeks went by, their bond deepened, perhaps more than it should have. One late afternoon, as the golden light of dusk poured through the trees, they found themselves alone in his office. The town had emptied out for the evening, and the quiet was oppressive. Turner sat at his desk, his fingers drumming on the wood as he watched Lily, who sat across from him, a pensive expression on her face. "You don't have to stay here forever," he said softly. "There's a better life waiting for you out there. You just have to reach for it." Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and confusion. "I don't know how to reach for something that feels so far away," she whispered. Without thinking, Turner crossed the room and sat next to her. His hand brushed against hers, an innocent gesture that lingered too long. There was a quiet moment of stillness, where the space between them seemed to shrink, where the air felt thick with something unspoken. Before they could acknowledge it, their faces inched closer, drawn by a magnetic pull neither could resist. And in that moment, they crossed a line, an invisible line that could never be undone. Sarah Turner had always prided herself on being the dutiful sheriff's wife, the woman who stood by her husband through thick and thin, the image of grace and loyalty in a town that looked up to her husband with reverence. But over time, something had begun to gnaw at her. A quiet unease had settled in her heart, and the routine of her life with Marcus began to feel like a cage she couldn't escape from. He had become distant, his late nights at the office more frequent, his smiles less genuine. It was during one of those long nights when Sarah decided to follow him. She had tried to ignore the whispers, the way the townsfolk spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening, the odd glances exchanged between Marcus and Lily whenever they were in town together. Sarah knew better than to ask questions she wasn't ready to hear the answers to. But tonight, something was different. A suspicion had taken root, and she could no longer ignore it. As she stood outside the sheriff's office, watching from a distance, she saw Marcus and Lily talking, their heads close together. A chill ran through Sarah as she noticed how they looked at each other, how the space between them seemed to disappear in the quiet intimacy of their conversation. Her heart pounded in her chest as the truth began to dawn on her. Before she could process the enormity of what she had just witnessed, Marcus reached out and touched Lily's arm, a small, tender gesture that spoke volumes. Sarah's stomach turned as she felt the weight of betrayal settle heavily on her shoulders. She didn't wait to see more. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. There was no turning back now. She knew what was happening, and she knew that she wouldn't let it continue. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The image of Marcus and Lily, their connection so undeniably intimate, played over and over in her mind. She tried to calm herself, to reason through the waves of emotion crashing against her. But the anger, the betrayal, it consumed her in a way that left no room for rational thought. The next morning, she woke up with a cold clarity. Her mind was made up. She couldn't just confront Marcus. Not yet. That wouldn't be enough. She had to make Lily understand what she had done. She had to make her pay for the destruction she had caused. It was a quiet morning, the sun barely beginning to rise as Sarah prepared herself. Her hands trembled with a mix of fear and fury, but she quickly shoved both aside. The woman who had been the pillar of her marriage was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, a person who had been driven to the edge by love, jealousy, and pain. She drove to the shelter where Lily had been staying, her mind fixed on the one thing she knew she had to do. Her heart pounded in her chest as she parked the car, staring at the old, crumbling building. Sarah stepped out, her shoes clicking on the concrete as she made her way inside. There was no turning back. Her blood was boiling, and with each step she took, the weight of her actions grew heavier. Lily was there, sitting alone in a corner, her face weary as always. When she saw Sarah, she didn't stand, didn't move, just watched her, as if sensing the storm that was about to hit. Sarah walked over to her, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said coldly, her voice low but heavy with venom. Lily looked up, confused. "What about?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward, her hands shaking with rage. In an instant, she grabbed Lily by the collar, yanking her up to her feet. The anger that had been building for so long erupted like a storm, a fury that consumed every rational thought. "You think you can just waltz into my life, into my marriage, and destroy everything I've worked for?" Sarah's voice was a shrill, uncontrollable scream now, echoing off the walls of the shelter. "You think you can have him, take him from me, and get away with it?" Lily, stunned and frightened, tried to break free from Sarah's grip. But Sarah's hold was ironclad. There was no escape. The desperation in Lily's eyes only fueled Sarah's rage more. "Please, stop," Lily whimpered, her voice barely audible. But Sarah's anger had clouded her judgment, the guilt and heartbreak transforming into an uncontrollable desire for retribution. She threw Lily against the wall, knocking the breath out of her. Lily crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, but Sarah wasn't done. "You won't ruin my life," she hissed, kneeling beside Lily, her hands still shaking with fury. "I'll make sure you never see him again. I'll make sure you never have anyone." In that moment, something in Sarah snapped. An irreversible decision that would haunt her forever. The pain of betrayal turned to violence as she began to strike Lily, each hit landing with a sickening finality. The sound of her blows filled the room, drowning out everything else. Lily fought, but the power of Sarah's rage was overwhelming. Blood stained the floor beneath them as Lily's strength waned, her cries growing weaker with each passing second. Sarah's hands were trembling, her chest rising and falling in rapid breaths, but her mind was numb. The rage that had once driven her to this point was now fading, leaving behind only the aftermath of her actions. She stared down at Lily, who was no longer fighting back, her body limp on the cold floor. Blood smeared across her face, pooling on the concrete beneath her. For a moment, Sarah stood there, her fists clenched, her heart racing in her chest. She had done it. She had ended the threat to her marriage, to her life. But as the fog of her anger began to lift, something much worse than guilt began to take root. What had she done? The silence in the room was suffocating. Sarah kneeled beside Lily's motionless body, her breath shallow and panicked. She reached out with trembling fingers, pressing them to Lily's neck, desperate to feel the pulse that should have been there. But there was nothing. No sign of life. Lily was gone. For a moment, Sarah sat frozen, staring at the lifeless girl. The weight of her actions began to crush her, suffocating her with a guilt so profound it felt as if the walls were closing in around her. She had taken a life. She had murdered someone in cold blood, someone who had never deserved to die. And in that moment, Sarah understood the consequences of her rage. There was no taking it back, no undoing the horrors she had unleashed. Sheriff Turner had been out on patrol, following up on a few minor disturbances in the town. His mind was preoccupied with the tasks at hand, unaware that the world he had built was crumbling in his absence. He had no idea that his life, the fragile semblance of order he had tried to preserve, was about to shatter. As he approached the sheriff's office, something felt off. The silence in the air was thick, oppressive. When he walked in, the first thing that struck him was the smell, a metallic, pungent scent that made his stomach churn. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The office was as quiet as always, save for the faint sound of Sarah's footsteps as she moved about in the back. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice low, but it echoed off the walls. No response. His gut twisted, a growing sense of dread creeping over him. He moved down the hall, past the sheriff's office, and into the back room. And then he saw it, the sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lily's body lay crumpled on the floor. Blood pooled around her head, staining the concrete. Her blonde hair, once so full of life, was now matted and lifeless. Sheriff Turner's heart sank, a cold wave of panic flooding his veins. His breath hitched in his chest as his eyes slowly lifted, locking onto Sarah, who stood at the doorway, her hands covered in blood, her face ashen. The world around him seemed to tilt, everything moving in slow motion as the truth hit him with brutal clarity. His heart pounded in his chest, his legs shaking as he struggled to comprehend what had happened. His wife, the woman he had sworn to protect, was standing there, her body rigid with guilt. "Sarah, what did you do?" His voice was barely a whisper, his shock rendering him speechless for a moment. Sarah's eyes flickered, avoiding his gaze. She couldn't meet his eyes, not after what she had done. She was shaking, the realization of her actions hitting her like a ton of bricks. I couldn't let her ruin us, Marcus. She was going to take everything from us." The words tumbled out of her mouth like a confession, a plea for understanding that never came. Sheriff Turner felt his blood run cold as he absorbed her words. His world had just fallen apart. His wife, the woman he had promised to love and cherish, had murdered an innocent girl out of jealousy, out of madness. He stepped back, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorframe to steady himself. You killed her, Sarah. She didn't answer. Her lips trembled, but no words came. The tears that filled her eyes were too late. Her actions had sealed their fate. Turner couldn't breathe. The rage he had felt for Lily now swirled into an overwhelming sense of helplessness, a loss so profound that it left him reeling. Everything he had worked for, the life he had tried to build, was gone in an instant. The weight of the silence between them was unbearable. Sheriff Turner stood frozen in the doorway, his entire world shattered in front of him. He had always prided himself on keeping control, over the town, over his life, over his marriage. But now, there was nothing left to control. Sarah finally lifted her eyes to meet his, her expression a twisted combination of regret and defiance. "I did what I had to do, Marcus," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "She was a threat to everything we've built. She had to be stopped." Turner felt a surge of nausea flood his system, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "You killed her," he said again, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. He couldn't believe it. His wife, his partner in everything, had taken the life of an innocent girl in a fit of jealousy. His mind raced, desperate for an explanation that would make sense of the chaos. But there was no reason, no justification that could undo the damage. All he saw in front of him was the blood-stained woman he had once loved, now nothing more than a stranger. "You don't understand," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "She was going to take you from me, Marcus. You don't see how she looked at you. How she—" "Enough!" Sheriff Turner snapped, his voice rising, shaking the walls. "This isn't about her, Sarah. This is about you. You chose to take her life, to destroy everything we've built together, all because you couldn't face the truth. You couldn't accept that I was helping her." His words hit Sarah like a slap. Her face twisted in pain, but she didn't argue. She knew what she had done, and the enormity of her crime was too much to bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the tears finally spilling from her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do." Sheriff Turner turned away from her, his heart breaking with every passing second. He couldn't look at her anymore. Not like this. The woman he had once trusted, the woman who had stood by his side through everything, had become a monster in his eyes. And as much as he loved her, he knew there was no going back. He walked toward the door, each step echoing in the stillness of the room. "I can't stay here," he muttered under his breath, though his voice felt hollow. "You've crossed a line I can't uncross, Sarah." Sarah's voice trembled, desperation seeping through her words. "Marcus, please, don't leave me. I need you." But Sheriff Turner didn't respond. He couldn't. He opened the door and stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of his actions hanging over him like a storm cloud. As he walked away from the shelter, from his wife, from everything he had ever known, the town seemed eerily silent, as if it too was mourning the tragedy that had just unfolded. The days that followed were a blur of confusion, anger, and heartbreak. News of Lily's death spread like wildfire through the small town, and whispers soon turned into accusations. Sheriff Turner found himself haunted by a bitter reality. His wife had taken a life, and the community would never look at them the same again. For Sarah, the guilt was unbearable. She couldn't escape the images of Lily's lifeless body, the sound of her final cries echoing in her mind. No matter how much she tried to rationalize her actions, there was no denying what she had done. There was no place in the world where she could hide from herself. But the consequences of her crime were not hers to bear alone. Sheriff Turner, now living in the shadow of his wife's actions, became a pariah in his own town. His colleagues, once his trusted allies, now avoided him, their faces filled with judgment and pity. The man they had once respected was now the husband of a murderer. When the authorities launched an investigation into Lily's death, the truth slowly began to surface. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Sarah was arrested, charged with second-degree murder. The town was stunned. The sheriff, once a symbol of justice, was now entangled in a scandal that no one had seen coming. In the courtroom, Sarah's fate was sealed. The trial was brief, but the impact would last a lifetime. Her defense tried to claim that she had acted in a moment of passion, that she had been pushed to the edge by her own insecurities. But there was no escaping the reality of the situation. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, her life irreparably altered. Her world had crumbled, and there would be no rebuilding it. The once beautiful house they had shared stood abandoned, its walls hollow with the memories of what had been lost. As for Sheriff Turner, his life was shattered beyond repair. He left his position as sheriff, unable to face the community he had once served. His heart was a void, a place where love had once flourished, but was now consumed by grief and regret. He disappeared from the town, no longer the man he had been. The townspeople would remember him as a shadow of his former self, a man who had lost everything in a moment of weakness, whose wife had sealed their tragic fate. The small town that had once been so familiar and safe now stood as a reminder of the fragility of human nature. People would come and go, but the stain of the tragedy would never wash away. The sheriff's badge would be retired, the legacy of a man who had fallen victim to his own desires and the destructive force of jealousy. Sarah, locked away in prison, would forever bear the weight of her crime. And the memory of Lily, the homeless girl who had once been a flicker of hope in the sheriff's life, would linger long after the dust had settled. In the end, the story of the sheriff, his wife, and the young girl they had destroyed was one of love gone wrong, of a life built on deception, and the irreparable consequences of actions driven by rage. If this story made you think, left you questioning the fragility of trust and the destructive power of jealousy, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that explores the darker side of human nature. Don't forget to share this video with your friends. You never know who might need a story like this to spark a conversation. Have you ever wondered what might have happened if things had gone differently for Sarah or the sheriff? Could forgiveness have healed their wounds, or was it truly too late? Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and let's continue the conversation. And if you're interested in more gripping, thought-provoking stories like this, turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest videos. Until next time, stay curious.